Maria Gonzalez was 28 when she entered that meeting room at the Pentagon. Her footsteps echoed down the hallway as she carried a black briefcase filled with classified documents she had reviewed for weeks. Sergeant Davis, a burly man with over 15 years of service, stood beside the main door of the conference room. He watched her with that expression Maria knew so well, that look that clearly said she didn't belong there. It was the same expression she'd seen since enlisting in the Navy at 19, coming from a small town in Texas, where no one expected a Hispanic girl to amount to anything. The meeting was about naval logistics strategies for operations in the Pacific. Maria had been assigned as a junior analyst due to her exceptional work in cryptography and communications over the past 3 years. She had deciphered patterns that other, more experienced analysts couldn't identify, and had created security protocols that were implemented at 4 different naval bases. But none of that seemed to matter when she entered rooms dominated by men who saw her only as an intruder. Sergeant Davis partially blocked the entrance as Maria approached. Inside the room, she could see at least 20 officers seated around a huge mahogany table. Digital maps projected sea routes onto the walls, and screens displayed data on fleet movements. It was exactly the kind of meeting she'd been preparing for months. Davis crossed his arms over his impeccably dressed uniform. He bore medals that testified to combat in Iraq and Afghanistan, and he used that experience as a shield against anyone he considered inferior. Maria had dealt with men like him before. They were everywhere in the armed forces. Men who believed women belonged behind desks typing reports, not participating in strategic decisions. Maria showed her identification and the assignment order signed by Captain Morrison. Davis barely glanced at the documents. He simply shook his head with a condescending smile that made Maria's blood boil. She maintained her composure, something she had learned to do perfectly over the years. Never show emotion, never give them the satisfaction of seeing that their words or actions affected her. The sergeant finally spoke, his deep voice echoing in the silent corridor. He said there had been a mistake, that the meeting was restricted to senior personnel only, and that she must be confusing the rooms. Maria felt that familiar sensation in her stomach, that mixture of anger and frustration that had accompanied her since military academy. She calmly replied that there had been no mistake, that she was assigned to that specific meeting, and that her documents were in order. Davis looked her up and down, his contempt barely disguised. He said perhaps she should go back to her office and check with her superiors again. Maybe there was some filing work that needed to be done. Maybe she could be useful organizing documents somewhere less important. His words were like small knives, cutting with the precision of someone who had used those tactics many times before. Maria took a deep breath. She thought of all the times she had proven her worth, all the moments she had exceeded expectations, all the times she had been forced to work twice as hard, only to receive half the recognition. She thought of her mother, who cleaned houses to pay for her school expenses, of her father, who worked in construction 16 hours a day. She thought of everyone who doubted her, who said that girls like her had no future in the armed forces. She was about to insist again when Davis took the final step. He ordered her to leave the area immediately. It wasn't a request, it was a direct order. His voice rose, drawing curious glances from some officers passing by in the corridor. Maria felt a blush rise up her neck, not from shame, but from pure indignation. She had followed all the protocols, fulfilled all the requirements, and yet she was being treated like an intruder. It was then that something happened inside the conference room. There was a movement, the sound of a chair being pushed back against the wooden floor. All the seated officers immediately stood at attention. Sergeant Davis turned sharply, his expression of superiority instantly vanishing, replaced by something close to panic. A tall figure was rising from the head of the table, and Maria immediately recognized the 4 stars shining on his shoulders. Admiral James Patterson was 62 years old and had a reputation that preceded him in every corridor of the Pentagon. He had commanded carrier strike groups during critical conflicts, had restructured entire divisions of the Navy, and was known for 2 things: his unparalleled strategic brilliance and his absolute intolerance of any form of discrimination or incompetence. He was a tall, broad-shouldered man, with precisely cut gray hair and piercing blue eyes that seemed to assess everything around him in seconds. Patterson walked toward the door with measured, deliberate steps. An absolute silence fell over the room. Even whispered conversations ceased completely. Everyone present knew that when the Admiral moved in that manner, something important was about to happen. Maria remained where she was, her briefcase still firmly held against her chest, unsure of exactly what to expect. The Admiral stopped directly beside Sergeant Davis, who seemed to have shrunk several inches. Patterson looked at Maria first, his eyes quickly scanning her identification and then her face. There was something in that look that wasn't condescension or doubt, but pure and simple assessment. Then he turned to Davis, and his voice when he spoke was low, but it carried a weight that made everyone in the hallway take notice. Patterson asked the sergeant if there was a problem. His voice was calm, almost casual, but there was a layer of steel beneath every word. Davis tried to explain, his voice stumbling over the words as he spoke about security protocols and clearance checks. The Admiral interrupted him mid-sentence, something he rarely did, but when he did, everyone knew the situation was serious. The Admiral then asked a simple question. He asked if Davis had properly verified Analyst Gonzalez's credentials. Davis began to reply that he had looked, but Patterson raised his hand, silencing him immediately. He took the documents from Maria's hands, not rudely, but with the authority of someone accustomed to taking charge of situations. He examined each page meticulously, his expression remaining neutral. When he finished, Patterson returned the documents to Maria and turned completely to Davis. He said that Analyst Gonzalez not only had authorization to be at that meeting, but that her presence had been specifically requested by him. Every word landed like a hammer. Patterson explained that he had personally reviewed Maria's work on the new encrypted communication protocols, that her analyses had identified critical vulnerabilities that senior analysts had missed, and that her work had potentially saved American lives. Davis's face had turned red, then white. He tried to apologize, but the Admiral wasn't finished yet. Patterson said he expected everyone under his command to treat their colleagues with professional respect, regardless of rank, gender, or background. He said the United States Navy had no room for prejudice or assumptions based on appearances. He said every person who wore that uniform had earned the right to be there through hard work and dedication. Maria remained motionless, processing what was happening. It was rare, almost unheard of, for an officer of such high rank to intervene directly in a situation like this. She had expected to have to fight her battle alone, as she always did, perhaps filing a formal complaint after being ignored or downplayed. But here was one of the most powerful men in the Navy, defending not only her right to be present, but her professional worth. Patterson then addressed Maria directly. He apologized for the delay and said they were expecting her to begin the next phase of the meeting. He explained that her analysis of enemy communication patterns would be essential to the decisions they would make that day. He held the door open, a simple but powerful gesture, indicating that she should enter. Maria walked past Davis without looking at him. She entered the room where 20 pairs of eyes were now watching her with a very different expression than she had imagined they would have minutes before. There was no longer any doubt or questioning in those gazes, only professional curiosity and perhaps a newfound respect. The Admiral led her to a seat near the head of the table, a prominent position that made clear her importance to the meeting. As Maria opened her briefcase and prepared her materials, she overheard Patterson giving Davis final instructions in the hallway. The words were too whispered for her to hear completely, but the tone made it clear there would be consequences. When the Admiral returned to the room, he closed the door firmly behind him, and the meeting officially began. Over the next 3 hours, Maria presented her findings on communication interception patterns. She explained how she had identified repetitive sequences in seemingly random transmissions, and how she had created algorithms to predict vulnerability windows in enemy security systems. The officers present asked complex technical questions, and Maria answered each one with confidence and precision. She used digital maps to demonstrate how her findings could be applied in real-world operational scenarios. Colonel Williams, a 30-year veteran, inquired about the implications of her analyses for submarine operations. Maria not only answered the question, but expanded her response to include considerations of ocean geography and weather patterns that could affect transmissions. Captain Chen, a cyber warfare specialist, inquired about possible enemy countermeasures. Maria had anticipated this question and had prepared 3 different scenarios with appropriate responses. As the meeting progressed, Maria noticed something shifting in the room's dynamic. The officers were no longer simply tolerating her presence or listening politely. They were genuinely engaged with their work, taking notes, asking for clarification, building upon her ideas. This is how it Should always be, she thought. Evaluation based on merit and competence, not on assumptions or biases. Admiral Patterson asked his own questions, some of the most challenging of all. He questioned her methodologies, asked her to defend her conclusions, and explored potential limitations of her analyses. But there was something different about how he did it. It wasn't a test to prove she didn't belong there, but a genuine exercise in critical thinking to strengthen the work. Maria responded to each challenge, sometimes admitting uncertainties where they existed, but always demonstrating that she had considered all angles. When the meeting finally ended, Patterson asked Maria to stay for a few minutes while the others left. She felt a moment of apprehension, unsure of what to expect. When they were alone in the room, the Admiral sat casually on the edge of the table, a surprisingly informal posture for someone of his position. He said he wanted her to know something important. He explained that he had spent 4 decades in the armed forces and had seen the institution change, though not always as quickly as it should have. He said there were still people like Sergeant Davis, people stuck in old mindsets, but that they were increasingly becoming exceptions rather than the rule. He said the Navy's future depended on people like Maria, who brought not only technical competence, but different perspectives and a willingness to challenge the status quo. Maria thanked him, but Patterson shook his head. He said she didn't need to thank him for being treated with the respect she deserved. He then mentioned something that surprised her. He said he had grown up in a poor neighborhood in Detroit, the son of a factory worker and a secretary. He said that when he entered the Naval Academy in the 70s, there were people who thought that working-class boys lacked the refinement necessary for military leadership. He said he had proven them wrong, just as Maria was proving the skeptics wrong now. The Admiral then made an offer. He said he was assembling a special task force focused on advanced communications intelligence and cyber warfare. It was a high-priority project that would report directly to his office. He wanted Maria to be part of the core team, not as a junior analyst, but as a senior technical specialist. It would be a significant promotion and would put her on the path to higher leadership positions. Maria was momentarily speechless. It was the kind of opportunity analysts took 10 or 15 years to get, if they got it at all. But Patterson made it clear that the offer was based purely on her work. He said he had reviewed every report she had produced in the last 2 years, that he had consulted with her direct supervisors, that he had even discreetly checked her academic evaluations. Everything pointed to the same conclusion. She was exceptionally talented and dedicated. She accepted, of course. How could she not? It was everything she had worked for, everything she had dreamed of when she decided to enlist against the advice of almost everyone she knew. But there was something deeper happening in that moment. It wasn't just about the promotion or the recognition. It was about validation, about someone in a position of real authority, seeing beyond the superficialities and recognizing genuine value. In the following weeks, Maria learned through informal channels that Sergeant Davis had been transferred to an administrative position where he would not have direct contact with operational personnel. It wasn't a severe punishment, but it was a clear message. Patterson had also ordered additional diversity and inclusion training for all Pentagon security personnel, using the incident as a case study without mentioning specific names. Maria embraced her new responsibilities with the same meticulous dedication that had always characterized her work. The task force included some of the Navy's best specialists, and initially some were skeptical about her presence. But just as in the meeting on that crucial day, she let her work speak for itself. Within 3 months, her contributions had become indispensable to the project. She developed a predictive analytics system that could identify emerging cyber threats 72 hours in advance. She created response protocols that were adopted by all Pacific fleets. She trained other analysts in her methodologies, sharing knowledge instead of keeping it to herself. And when new junior members joined the team, especially women or people from underrepresented backgrounds, she made a point of serving as a mentor and advocate. Years later, when Maria was already a captain and commanded her own intelligence division, she often thought about that day at the Pentagon. She thought about how her entire career could have been derailed by a prejudiced sergeant if it hadn't been for the intervention of an admiral who truly believed in meritocracy. She used that experience to inform how she led her own teams, ensuring that talent was recognized regardless of who possessed it. She also maintained occasional contact with Patterson, who had retired but remained influential in advocacy circles. He always inquired about her work, offered advice when asked, but mostly just expressed pride in seeing how she had flourished. For him, that moment in the hallway hadn't been exceptional. It had simply been the right thing to do. But for Maria, it had been transformative, a turning point that validated years of struggle and opened doors she didn't even know existed. The story of that day circulated through the Navy in ways none of them anticipated. It became a kind of legend, told in academies and bases as an example of true leadership and how a person in a position of power can completely change the trajectory of another. Some details were exaggerated in the retelling, others simplified, but the essence remained, that Maria Gonzalez was someone who should never have been underestimated. Years had passed since that day at the Pentagon, and Maria Gonzalez now occupied an office on the 3rd floor of the Naval Cyber Operations Command in Norfolk, Virginia. Its walls displayed advanced cybersecurity certifications, commendations for exceptional service, and a framed photograph from the ceremony where she received her promotion to captain. But among all these symbols of achievement, there was one image she particularly cherished, a discreet photo of Admiral Patterson during her retirement ceremony, where she had been invited to speak about transformative leadership. The division Maria commanded had grown considerably. 43 specialists worked under her direct supervision, monitoring cyber threats in real time, developing countermeasures for sophisticated attacks, and training personnel from other units in advanced security protocols. Her team had a formidable reputation, not only for technical competence but for the inclusive culture Maria had intentionally cultivated. On one particular morning in October, Maria was reviewing intelligence reports when her assistant, Lieutenant Sarah Mitchell, knocked on the door. Mitchell was 24 years old, a graduate of the Naval Academy with a degree in applied mathematics, and exactly the type of bright young officer Maria always sought to recruit. The lieutenant seemed visibly disturbed, something unusual for someone normally so composed. Maria motioned for her to come in and close the door. Mitchell hesitated for a moment before explaining that she had just come from an interdepartmental meeting where her work on intrusion detection algorithms had been completely ignored. A commander from another division had presented the same ideas as if they were his own, and when Mitchell politely tried to clarify the authorship, she was silenced and then reprimanded for interrupting a superior officer. Maria listened to every word without interrupting, immediately recognizing the pattern. It was the same dynamic she had faced countless times, that systematic attempt to erase contributions and undermine credibility. She asked some direct questions to fully understand the context and extent of the situation. Mitchell provided precise details, including names, dates, and documentation, proving his authorship of the work. Instead of simply offering words of encouragement or promising to investigate later, Maria acted immediately. She picked up the phone and called directly the office of the Vice Admiral responsible for that specific division. Her voice was professional, but firm, as she requested an urgent meeting to discuss intellectual property issues and professional conduct. The meeting was scheduled for that same afternoon. Maria took Mitchell with her, along with all the relevant documentation. At the meeting, she presented the case methodically and irrefutably. She showed records of when Mitchell had first proposed his algorithms, emails demonstrating the development of the concept, and even system logs proving when the work had been submitted. Then she contrasted this with the timeline of the commander who had claimed authorship, clearly demonstrating the impossibility of him having developed something so complex in the alleged period. The Vice Admiral was not one to tolerate dishonesty or attempts to take credit for the work of others. He thanked Maria for bringing the matter to his attention and assured her that there would be appropriate consequences. More importantly, he publicly acknowledged Mitchell's contribution and ordered that his name be properly credited in all related documents and presentations. After the meeting, as they walked back across the base campus, Mitchell was visibly emotional. She said she never imagined anyone would actually defend her in that way, that she was prepared to simply swallow the injustice and move on. Maria stopped walking and looked directly at the young lieutenant. Maria said she had learned something fundamental years ago when an admiral decided not only to intervene, but to make a statement about how people should be treated. She explained that leadership didn't just mean managing resources or completing missions, but protecting and promoting those who did the real work. She said Mitchell had exceptional talent, and that allowing it to be exploited or silenced would be a failure of command. But Maria also shared something more personal. She recounted that day at the Pentagon, how Sergeant Davis had prevented her from entering, how she was prepared to fight alone once again. She described how Patterson not only rectified the situation, but used that moment to teach a greater lesson about respect and meritocracy. She said that incident had fundamentally shaped how she understood her role as a senior officer. Mitchell listened with absolute attention, and when Maria finished, she asked a simple but profound question. She asked if things were really changing or if each generation would have to fight the same battles. Maria considered the question carefully before answering. She said that yes, things were changing, but that progress was neither automatic nor irreversible. It required constant vigilance and people willing to act when they witnessed injustice. In the following months, Maria noticed a change in Mitchell. The lieutenant became more assertive in meetings, more confident in presenting her ideas, and more willing to challenge incorrect assumptions. But more importantly, Maria saw Mitchell begin to do for others what had been done for her, defending junior analysts when they were ignored, ensuring credit was given where it was deserved, and creating spaces where diverse talents could flourish. This dynamic was replicated throughout Maria's division. Her team developed a reputation not only for technical excellence, but for integrity and mutual support. Officers from other units frequently requested transfers to work under her command, drawn to the culture she had built, and those who trained with her team took those lessons back to their own units, creating a ripple effect throughout the organization. One afternoon, Maria received an unexpected call. It was Admiral Patterson himself, now 70 years old but still active on various defense advisory boards. He was organizing a symposium on military modernization and wanted Maria to be one of the keynote speakers, not just to talk about technology, but about leadership and cultural transformation in the armed forces. Maria accepted, of course, but she felt the weight of the responsibility. Speaking about these topics meant being vulnerable, sharing personal experiences of discrimination and struggle. It meant risking being seen as focused on identity issues rather than professional competence. But she also knew that silence had never created change, that personal stories were often what truly resonated with people and inspired action. On the day of the symposium, held in an auditorium at the Naval Academy in Annapolis, Maria stood before 300 officers of all ranks and branches of the armed forces. Patterson introduced her personally, recounting a concise but impactful version of that Pentagon story from years earlier. He said that Maria exemplified the type of leader the armed forces of the 21st century needed, someone who combined technical excellence with an unwavering commitment to justice and human dignity. Maria stepped onto the podium and for a moment simply looked at the audience. Then she began to speak, not from prepared notes, but from the heart. She spoke about growing up in Texas, about deciding to enlist, despite all the voices saying it wasn't the place for her. She spoke about the countless moments of doubt, the daily microaggressions, the constant pressure of having to prove her worth repeatedly. But she also spoke about mentors who believed in her, about colleagues who supported her, about leaders like Patterson who used their power to open doors instead of closing them. She challenged the audience to consider how many talents were lost because organizations failed to recognize or cultivate them. How many brilliant people gave up not for lack of ability, but for emotional exhaustion from constantly fighting for basic respect. How many innovations never happened because diverse voices were silenced before they could contribute. She said this was not just a moral issue, but a strategic one, that the armed forces could not afford to waste any human resources in an increasingly complex world. The response was more intense than Maria had anticipated. During the question and answer period, officers shared their own experiences, both of facing discrimination and of witnessing it, and not knowing how to intervene effectively. Conversations continued in the hallways for hours after the formal briefing. Patterson observed everything with visible satisfaction, knowing he had made the right choice in inviting Maria to speak. Weeks later, Maria received dozens of emails from people who had been at the symposium. Some shared how her words had inspired changes in how they led their own teams. Others asked for advice on specific situations they faced. Several young officers, especially women and people from minority groups, wrote simply to say that Maria's story gave them hope that they could persevere and eventually thrive. Among all these messages, there was one from a young cadet at the Naval Academy who had attended the symposium as part of her leadership training. She wrote that she had been seriously considering quitting because she didn't feel welcome, because she was tired of fighting. But after hearing Maria, she decided to stay. She decided she would be one more person working to make things change. Maria personally responded to each email, especially the one from the cadet. She offered guidance, shared resources, and made it clear that she was available if they needed support. Because in the end, that's what that moment in the Pentagon hallway had taught her, that people in positions of power and influence had a responsibility to use that not only to advance their own careers, but to pave the way for others. In his last annual review, Maria's direct supervisor wrote that she had become not only an exceptional technical leader, but a transformative force within the institution. Her division consistently exceeded expectations in operational metrics while also setting new standards for organizational culture. It was exactly the kind of legacy Maria wanted to build, proving that excellence and humanity were not conflicting goals, but mutually reinforcing ones. And somewhere in a box in her office, stored alongside medals and certificates, Maria kept copies of those original assignment orders that Sergeant Davis had tried to ignore. She kept them not as a memento of victimization, but as a testament to progress, to a moment when someone chose to do what was right, even when it would have been easier not to, doing nothing, establishing a pattern that she now strove to maintain every day.